Welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. First time host Donald, and I'm joined by James Pogue, back by popular request, and Joey Keegin. I, I don't think I need to introduce either of them really. But James is a writer. And he wrote a very interesting book about struggles about land use in the American West and the Bundy occupation. You can read his writing in Harper's Magazine, a bunch of other places. Uh, Joey Keegin is a PhD student at Tulane studying philosophy. He's also a writer. You can read his writing at The Point and Athwart, and other places. The Chronicle of Higher Education, even. And This episode nearly didn't happen now for the second time. And the first time we attempted it, James's dog got loose.
True.
And then this time, my 2-year-old projectile vomited all over the couch. But here
Not
we
on
are.
the couch.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a little bit of a whirlwind, but I got all the couch cushions, like the couch cushion covers off, got the kid in the bath, got her tucked into bed. So
Nice.
ready to go. Okay, now we had to figure out what we're going to talk about. So I thought we would break new ground for the Doomer Optimism podcast and spend the next 5 hours dissecting the Cincinnati Bengals offense over the last 2 Sundays, and Joe Burrow's heroic performances without his best receiver. Or we could talk about something else. So the thing that I wanted to start with, if it's okay with you guys, then we can actually talk about ourselves. Because both of you wrote interesting articles introducing American writers that, in the case of James, DeVoto was once like a very well-known writer, won like the National Book Award or the Pulitzer or something. He won major book award, but has since become kind of forgotten. I have this book of his that you recommended, Across the Wide Missouri, and then Joey, you've written about an American author who actually I think, it's possible he and DeVoto knew each other actually, which is Henry Bugbee. And so I wonder if the two of you could both just briefly introduce those writers to everybody, and then we'll just see where it goes from there. So why don't you go first, Joey, and just tell us about who Henry Bugbee is, his life and his thinking, and why we ought to care about him. And then James, you could do the same with DeVoto, and then we can talk about the Bengals.
I hope we eventually talk some about just the Ohio Valley generally. I think that's really fruitful territory. Henry Bugbee was not from the Ohio Valley. He was a writer. One might call him a philosopher, perhaps. At the very least, a philosophy professor who was educated at Princeton and then University of California, Berkeley, and then went off to have a rather kind of unillustrious career, or maybe illustrious. I mean, he taught at a number of really important places. He had a position at Harvard for a brief period of time. He taught at Penn State, and he famously wrote only one book in his entire life called
"The Inward
Morning,"
this cover, everyone.
named after a.
Look at the cover. It's
a pretty good cover. University of Georgia Press keeps
philosophy book cover. Yeah.
But yeah, he's a really interesting guy. He was good friends with a whole bunch of different kinds of kind of 20th century philosophical figures. He did a couple of seminars with Heidegger. He knew Hans-Georg Gadamer to some extent. Willem van Orman Quine hired him at Harvard and said that he was something like the great exemplar of the examined life or the philosophical life or something like that. But he refused to publish very much, and so he never really was able to keep much of a position. Eventually, he got a job at the University of Montana, where he taught philosophy for basically the whole rest of his life. He was there with Leslie Fiedler. Um, they actually ran a program together called the Integrated Studies Program. That was like this great books thing that they launched at Montana together. But he was a really fascinating guy. His writing is a kind of American version of something that you've a kind of existentialism or sort of phenomenological approach to philosophy that you find in something like Heidegger or Gadamer, without any of the technical language. I mean, he writes in this very kind of like somewhat simplistic American vernacular that I think most readers would find pretty approachable and understandable, but obviously with a serious philosophical depth. And
Was he a
he
fly
was really
fisherman?
interested in the relationship. Say it again.
Was he a fly fisherman? Why do I have it in my head that
He
he's
was
a
a
fly
fly fisherman.
fisherman?
Yeah, he
Okay.
wrote. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of his big thing, was that he was really interested in the role of place in one's thinking, especially in sort of what we consider like moral thinking, the grounds of our moral reflection, and how your specific place in the world is connected to that. And he wrote a lot about like wilderness was a big theme in his writing, and fly fishing as a kind of like paradigmatic activity for what philosophy looks like, sort of being in wilderness and doing this activity that requires a lot of dexterity and skill, um, but isn't at the end of the day particularly complicated. Um, so yeah, I don't know. That's kind of like my Bugbee crash course. He's really interesting, and not enough people read him, but
That's a
people should
good
read him.
handoff for DeVoto, actually. So well landed there. That's interesting. So DeVoto, excuse me, mid-century American writer. He was in a both spiritual and literal sense, like a sort of forerunner of like the kind of class of, I'm going to say guy here and get myself in trouble, but they are generally guys who I consider my sort of peer and spiritual group or something, which would be sort of like the bookish Toyota truck driving, outdoors minded, but unfortunately stuck in intellectual life kind of American writer figure. And so DeVoto famously wrote a three-part, it's really a two-part, but we'll say three-part history of the early republic, running through the course of empire, which is basically telling the American story of the conquest of the continent through the story of riverine travel, and travel through riparian corridors. So it's literally the course of empire. The courses being everything from the Columbia to the Missouri. Then he wrote a history of the Trapper era West, that is called Across the Wide Missouri, which is what Don just showed. It's really incredible. And then I'm reading right now, I've never read before, a book called 1846, The Year of Decision, which is part of a genre probably of interest to a lot of people right now, of sort of books that cover the period of the 1840s when we knew we were headed towards political crisis and to some degree political economic division, but didn't have a great understanding at the time of where it was all going to lead. And so another great book in that tradition would be this book, David M. Potter's The Impending Crisis. But so DeVoto was from Ogden, Utah. He was a hunter all his life, a fly fisherman and outdoorsman. He moved to Cambridge though and taught at Harvard. He was friends with Julia Child. He was a bit of a lover boy to some degree. He had a kind of very colorful, elite, sort of professor personal life. I think his wife briefly fell in love with Robert Frost. And so he transcends a lot of these kind of like American outdoor transcendentalism, the expansion of the West, these kind of like great sort of intellectual currents that now we've often lost touch with. And maybe we can talk a little bit more of why that is. But the thing that maybe is of immediate interest to DeVoto is that his most famous journalistic work is something called The Plundered Province, where he elaborates this idea that the West is not kind of this collection of is not a region populated by like evil extractionist people, but actually that it's essentially a colonized zone that produces resources extracted by essentially Eastern and San Franciscan interests. And this was very new to a lot of people. And there were a lot of interests that DeVoto succeeded in really kind of screwing up. And so he managed to offend both left and right. He was like at one point sued by the Utah Cattlemen's Association for it's a long story, but he basically prevented a massive land grab by revealing like a plot essentially to sell off public lands. And he was derided by that. He was also derided as a rightist and a kind of, he was often called fascist by the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, because he essentially didn't toe the socialist line while teaching at Harvard. And so for all of that, I tend to find him like a kind of uniquely interesting and valuable figure today, because everything he does, despite the fact that it was lost, is sort of something that an intellectual has to navigate, especially if you're interested in the environment today. The political currents are similar. The intellectual currents that, you know, people in the DO world are rediscovering are pretty similar. And his kind of take on American history is essentially that America has and had the potential to be a positive force, and often that got derailed, and trying to figure out how to keep it on the rails or figure out what we did to lose the promise of colonizing this continent. And I think that that's something we all wrestle with right now. And so he's a particularly interesting writer.
He also edited an edition of the Journals of Lewis and Clark. I realized that my edition of the Journals of Lewis and Clark was edited by DeVoto. And the Journals of Lewis and Clark, it's an American classic that's now been, I don't know did anyone read it anymore? I don't know, but
it's absolutely
for a comeback.
It's absolutely incredible, and just it's incredibly readable. Like people who think like, oh, I don't read old journals and old histories and stuff, pick that up, and 100 pages later, you'll be like, wow, how did I get through this so fast? Yeah.
And another thing to say about Henry Bugbee is that he's the teacher of Cyril Welch, a completely, you know, probably unknown figure, taught for a long time at a small college in Canada, whom I discovered sort of by accident. And it turns out to be just incredibly cool. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, one last thing I'll say about Bugbee is that the important, or the most interesting things about his book, The Inward Morning, is that it's written as a series of journal entries. So he kind of he manages to marry the American tradition of journaling to a style of philosophy, a kind of like a, you know, reflective philosophy in a reflective mode. Yeah, he is. It's not the systematic work at all. It's a bunch of journal entries, some of which are just him thinking about thinking through philosophy with reference to, you know, Herman Melville or D.T. Suzuki, the Zen Buddhist writer, or reflecting on his time as a captain of like a cruiser in World War II in the Pacific Theater, or about his, you know, like experiences on the rowing team as an undergraduate at Princeton. It's a really peculiar sort of work of philosophy in a form that very few people have written in. I think his friend Gabriel Marcel, the French existentialist, has a similar book that's kind of like philosophy in the form of a journal. But of course, the other sort of great writer that inaugurates this kind of tradition is Thoreau. So Bugbee, I think, thinks of himself as a very American thinker, very doing philosophy in a very sort of American vernacular.
So James, something that you and I talked about in the last time we recorded one of these is how you and I have a shared history. We knew each other as teenagers in Ohio, and Joey, you and I have known each other for a really long time. And I have a shared history with both of you, and you two have extremely similar histories yourselves, but the two of you never actually met until relatively recently. So, I don't know where to go from that, other than like maybe it would be interesting to kind of think through our common past and how we got to where we are now. And in doing that, try to figure out where that is. I don't think we're not all at the same place now, but we're
Can I,
at the same-ish enough place that we're able to talk to each other. So, yeah, James, why don't you take a stab at that?
well, I was going to suggest that I think it's not a coincidence that, all of us were at various times anarchists. Perhaps even might think of ourselves as influenced or still anarchists. I don't know. Um, I don't think it's a coincidence that all of us were at various times influenced or interested in something called CrimethInc, which we should probably delve into. If you want to understand how we ended up here, I think you probably have to figure out why we were there first.
Hmm.
And I would suggest probably that Joey is the person to explain to the world what CrimethInc is.
I think Donald had the deepest engagement with this thing, but I'm happy to give it a shot, and you guys can tell me if I got it wrong.
Okay.
I guess like in the strictest sense, CrimethInc is kind of like was like an anarchist publication project. I think that was always like the core of the thing. But then kind of grew out of this publication project, printing kind of like, I don't know, anarchist agitprop and other forms of sort of literature and writing about anarchism and for the promotion of anarchism as a kind of not at all like as an intellectual thing, but as like a mode of life.
Mm-hmm.
It was very, very focused on living in a certain kind of way. But grew from that publication project into a much larger kind of subculture or movement or something like that.
Could I start the history a little bit differently?
Yeah, please.
So I think you have to say that what it emerges from is not politics, actually. What it emerges from is punk rock. That comes
absolutely
first.
Yeah.
So that it's the social environment that it emerges from, the intellectual environment it emerges from is punk rock first and foremost. And you can trace its development and its emergence from the old zine Inside Front. You can still find old copies of that. And so it's like punk rock and Nietzsche are honestly the formative things there. And anarchism gets brought in at some point. And there was the Maximum Rock and Roll, like the famous punk rock magazine, has now been digitized, like going all the way back to the beginning, and it's OCR searchable. So I've been like playing with that, like reading through the archive a little bit. And
first thing I ever published in a magazine, by the way, was in Maximum Rock and Roll.
That's fantastic.
That's funny.
I wrote a review of a collection of zines that were published in Lexington, Kentucky, in like the 80s called Lost. It was like a bunch of it was like they're all these guys that really invested in like new wave. They thought that punk rock was just like the first step on the way to the real thing, which was like new wave. I wrote a review of that for Maximum Rock and Roll when I was at St. John's College in like 2017. It was the first thing I had published.
Amazing.
Wow. So
I think it's hard to imagine now. Like, it's hard for me to imagine what it's like to come of age as a teenager without being a punk. It doesn't make sense to me, because I never dressed the part. But
we probably all agree on that, actually.
Yeah.
Like, I never dressed the part, but as a teenager and into my early 20s, it was like, going to house shows and I got to see we all got to see the turning point where when I was first coming up, it was still pen pals paper zines, paper flyers for shows. And then we got to be at the turning point where everything became the internet, which I think dissolved a lot of it. It didn't totally disintegrate it, but it changed it a lot, dissolved it. But there was a point when you could, as a relatively unknown band, tour the whole country and kind of make it work, like break even, sort of. And you could release a book or a zine or something and have it distributed to thousands of people just through those networks of shows and houses. And you could travel the country and stay for free at houses. That used to be a thing. Maybe it still is a thing, and I've just aged out of it. But that was the social environment that CrimethInc emerges from, and CrimethInc could have took what already existed in that and kind of put it out in book form and became the I don't know, the spokesman or something for it, and both took a lot of derision for that, but also I think inspired a lot of young people to take it up. And so I'm curious, the two of you, which came first? Whether you got exposed to the people and show, and then you found the magazines and the books, or whether you saw those and then like, oh, I need to go find these people.
So I think this is maybe not typical. I almost have like the dream version of what CrimethInc was trying to do, I experienced. And so like I'm super, super pro CrimethInc, despite maybe some of the problems that people would later identify. But so like I, as a say 15-year-old, was not cool and not that punk rock. And I never got that into punk the way you guys maybe did. Like I was never into like going to hardcore shows. I didn't like loud music. That was like not my thing per se. And so like for me, like I ended up like a 14, 15-year-old who believed that like security cameras and the increasing sort of like financialization of American life, like this kind of thing of you have to have a credit score, you have to have a job in order to get a truck, like you have to work all your life to be a participant in this system. Like it felt to me like prison. Like it felt to me like I was entering into a prison state that I really, really was rebelled against. Like I was like almost like at 14, I was like almost suicidal. I had to get pulled out of school. I was really depressed. I was like crying all the time. And it was in response to like looking around at this world and thinking, I am being conditioned to live in a prison state. I refuse to do this. This sucks. And I met sort of the circle of people around Dawn sometime around there and wasn't really that close with them. But somebody somewhere passed me this thing that was called, and I should clarify, I was already at this time, like kind of doing weird stuff. Like I was shoplifting all the time. I would hang out with homeless guys all the time because it felt like, oh, this is a place beyond the control of this system. I would go like climb on bridges and like over the Ohio River. I would climb over the steel structures and like sit out there and like, but it was all alone. And then I started getting these zines like at the library or from people who would pass them along. And the one that really changed my life was this thing called the DIY Guide. And the DIY Guide gave you ideas how to shoplift, how to dumpster dive, how to train hop, how to hitchhike. And the idea essentially behind this stuff was this is a map for you to live off the fat of this system. You don't want to be a part of this system. Okay, you don't like it. It's not telling you to how to go farm, how to homestead or whatever. But spiritually, it's a very similar thing. It's like this system is throwing off so much fat that you can step outside of it and live off the kind of fat of it and be fine. You're not going to have a job. You're not going to have retirement. You might not have kids, but you can kind of do this rebel existence outside the prison state, right? And that was super appealing to me. And it basically set me on a course for the rest of my life. Like the entire rest of my life has been trying to figure out ways to like influence this world for the better while also staying outside of the structures of that prison state. And it kind of sucks because like I still can't get a car loan. Like I don't have any money really, but like it set me on a path towards, and I'm sure we'll talk about this too, it set me on a path towards train hopping. It set me on a path towards being comfortable living in a ditch with homeless guys and not being scared of that, which is liberating. Like the one time I've ever had a job, and this was straight up CrimethInc. This is what they conditioned. They were trying to teach people this. But like 3 years ago, I talked to a recruiter. I was kind of broke. It was COVID. I was trying to figure out what to do. And I talked to a recruiter who like hooked me up with a job copywriting for Lyft, like the giant corporation. And they hired me. It was a lot of money. And I went to the first day. They mailed me a laptop. And I went to a meeting for like half an hour. And I was like, oh my God, like everything I've ever done in my life was to not do this. And I quit right then and there, bought a bottle of tequila, got really drunk. And I had like a truly spiritual experience. I was like, if I end up homeless in a ditch, that's what I chose. That will be better than this. Everything I wanted was to not be at Lyft doing this prison state panopticon Slack conversation. And it was really liberating. It was like, oh, anything I do writing wise or whatever, like I'm free of this because I'm fine being homeless. I'm fine living by shoplifting and dumpster diving. I don't fucking care. And that was something that CrimethInc thought, and I think that, or taught, and I think that was really positive. Other people may disagree.
No, I haven't almost like totally. I think very fondly about CrimethInc too, even now. I mean, I was like I was a total dweeb when I was a kid, right? I was like this like weird fat kid from the trailer park, and we got the internet really early in my house, and so for me, like I grew up mostly in rural Central Florida, in a double wide in a swamp. It was just like I didn't have many friends. I didn't live in a city. There wasn't anything interesting around, and so I was online a lot. And so much of my early life was just getting obsessed with music. Like learning how to download music came pretty early. I got Napster, and like I remember I think the first thing I downloaded on Napster was must have been in middle school. It's like 8th grade or something like that. And the very first song I ever downloaded on Napster, I think, was A Life of Possibilities by the Dismemberment Plan. If you guys know that band, it's still one of my great band. So I got really obsessed with music for a long time, right? And that was just like the thing that buoyed me while I was this like rural dweeb white trash guy living in a trailer park. And then when I was going into, I guess it was 10th grade, I did my first year of high school in Florida, and then my mom moved us all to West Virginia. So again, I want to point out that so much of this revolves around the Ohio Valley, which I think we need to talk about in its specificity at some point. But I was living in Huntington, West Virginia, on the Ohio River, and it was kind of one was kind of general national situation. The 9/11 had happened when I was in 9th grade, and then as I was living in West Virginia, the sort of early unfolding of sort of America going to war with Iraq started happening. And there was just something about watching that when I was a kid that I just knew was bullshit from the jump. And I just like reacted really strongly against it, and it just seemed totally wrong. And I don't know. So that was like a big influence for me, was just seeing this thing that all of the sort of major players in the world said was true just seemed completely fake and bad. And then alongside that, I was still listening to all this music. And then I was living in an interesting city for the first time, where I was meeting like different kinds of weird people. I had never really had that experience in Florida when I grew up there. And I sort of made some friends who were into punk rock, not just in the way that I was. I mean, my first exposure to like punk music or whatever was through Christian hardcore. But then I encountered some people for whom punk rock was like, it had a sort of different dimension to it. It was more about a way of living than it was just about like, records that you listen to or MP3s that you download or something. And but really, like, yeah, the sort of lead up to Iraq really cracked something open in my head. And at some point in that kind of like crisis, a friend injected the CrimethInc zine Fighting for Our Lives, and at the perfect time, like a sort of edgy, like 16 or 17-year-old in high school. I knew that something was horribly wrong with the world. I had been frustrated with, watching my my mom worked these like really demoralizing dead end jobs for my whole young life, living in these crappy circumstances. And yeah, and then and then this zine, which is all about, that there's a different, more passionate, more meaningful way of living, that doesn't come from getting like a fancy pants career or dedicating yourself to a profession or whatever, but comes from learning how to do weird stuff and living passionately alongside other people who are doing this kind of thing. I mean, that really spoke to my young heart. And then another that same friend ended up getting the other CrimethInc book, Days of War, Nights of Love, right? That's their more sustained theoretical effort. We read that together. I must have been a junior or senior in high school or something, and I just
I've still never read that book.
Oh, really?
It's hard to read. It's very like lyrical.
Yeah. It's very juvenile, right?
Yeah, it's very juvenile. But I would say, but I think there's an important point there. Is Days of Love, Nights of War emerges from a conception of struggle against a kind of soulless, deadening capitalist system that was spreading across the globe, which I think is important both for a DO conversation and if we want to talk about like CrimethInc's broader significance today in this world. CrimethInc emerged also from the anti-WTO protests. It emerged from an anti-globalization movement that was core to the anarchist project for so long. And that has, as we've talked about, I think probably Don and I have talked about, it evaporated suddenly from the kind of realm of conversation of the left. And I think all three of us, as people who grew up in the left, have had some trouble processing why that is and what the implications of that are. And I don't pretend to have great answers, but I think it's important for DO conversations as, a titularly localist podcast and group of people. Something changed there. And I think I won't speak for you guys, I retained the very sort of the vision that CrimethInc was putting forward of you can personally resist this system by the lifestyle choices you are making. I still think that's a positive vision and a good vision. And I think it's one that forms a lot of the visions of people who are neo-homesteaders now and things like that. I also think that the left that was at that time localist and against large impersonal structures of power is something that it's a spirit that disappeared from the left for reasons that I don't fully understand, but that helped kind of drive me out of feeling like I'm a part of the left as well. And I wish that I knew better why that had happened and what was going on.
I have a really simple explanation actually for a lot of these things. Okay. 2 words, Barack Obama. But let's get into that exactly. But I mean, it really is like, something happened, from what 2008 to 2012, that where the thing that I think all of us had fallen into, that was I'm not even sure. I didn't even think of it so much as like leftism. Like that wasn't the frame through which I thought about all of these things. I just thought of it as like it was largely about like living a better life. It was about like getting underneath or around like the dull grayness of the sort of like neoliberal dispensation, where everything was focused on like technology and like getting a stupid dead end job at some place or whatever. Like it's funny to think back like all the way back to the sort of like the beginning of this stuff for me, because I mean, when I was like a high school kid, I didn't have any conception of the world at all, right? Like I did all of my early schooling in like, Central Florida public schools. I didn't learn a lot, I was like a good student, but education didn't provide me very much. And then in West Virginia also, like, I went to just Huntington High School in Huntington, West Virginia, and like got like, whatever the pauper's education is in a place like that. And like I came out of it knowing nothing about anything, and so for me, what was so beautiful about CrimethInc was that it felt like an education in the world. Like it felt like it taught me something about about what the human being is. It felt like it taught me something about what kinds of things people do and what is possible in the world. And especially when I started actually participate, like, you know, when I was like hitchhiking and riding freight trains from like you know, various like punk houses and like weird punk rock projects and stuff like that. Like that was the first time that I really got to like see the world. You know, that was the first time the first time I ever saw the Pacific Ocean was because I rode a freight train from New Orleans out to Tucson, Arizona, and then rode up to San Francisco in an RV with a bunch of random like hippies that I'd never met before. And that was the first time I got to see this other side of the ocean. Like, I mean, CrimethInc for me was less about like resisting the system exactly. I mean, I think that was kind of a part of it, but that wasn't really the way that I thought about it. For me, it was about like learning about the world in like the most basic sense. It was, you know, getting out from the sort of proletarian narrowness that I felt was suffocating my life, and finding and you know learning how to skin animal hides and like make and like brew weird beers and stuff. Like that was all just kind of a part of it. It was about trying stuff out, the DIY spirit, so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I still have like really I still have my sympathies still really lie with these kinds of like hopeless abandoned political projects of like anti-globalization and stuff like that. I mean, that was what I came into when I first came into street level politics, was like, you know, people were still protesting free trade agreements. I went to Canada to participate in a protest against a free trade agreement that they were trying to sign up there called Atlantica, and my girlfriend went to prison for a weekend. You know, like that was where I cut my teeth.
Was that Quebec City?
It was in Halifax.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a free trade zone that was proposed across from like Halifax, New Brunswick, and also included like Maine and Vermont, New Hampshire, and some of New England. But yeah, I mean, I said this recently on another podcast I recorded, but like a thing that I noticed in the Obama years was people that I had known and had met in kind of like these, you know, DIY punk rock, going to anarchy inflected places, gradually or rapidly in some cases losing their sense of the world, like generally losing their interesting criticisms that they had about, you know, what education should look like, what, you know, what a human life should look like, etc., and just kind of just becoming like liberals. And it really freaked me out. I mean, it was just really weird for people who had like me undergone like really dull public school education, and had criticisms of that extremely dull public school education as being rather prison-like and boring and wasting your time and not teaching you anything, suddenly becoming like really enthusiastic defenders of the public school system without any sense of it being reformed. They were just like, no, public school is good. And I never forgot how lame public school was, I guess. I mean, like one of the rare ones, I don't know. But that transformation really bugged me out.
So
maybe I could give my
go for it. Sorry.
History. It's a little different, but there's commonalities maybe. So I grew up in a happy middle class family in Ohio. Had a very pleasant childhood. I was recently in Indiana seeing old friends, and someone asked me how I would describe my childhood, and I said happy and Midwestern. And I think that's true. As I got older, you know, as a lot of young people, I felt like out of sorts with the world, various ways, particularly with school, for a lot of the reasons you two described. Feeling it was a waste of time. I read a lot. I didn't, you know, I was arrogant. I felt like teachers didn't have anything to teach me, which, you know, there's good impulses in being a teenage autodidact and in teenage thinking you know more than you do, that can get you pretty far. Like I remember friends, we would like, you know, in middle school it was like finding all of the bands that Kurt Cobain said were cool, and like so I was listening to like Sonic Youth Records and the Wipers and all of these bands, and then starting to go to punk shows, and And I don't remember exactly where I first encountered CrimethInc stuff. I mean, I think in my mind, the best CrimethInc book is Evasion.
Yeah.
By far. That is by far the best book that they've ever did. And it's just a lot of fun. It's a modern day adventure story. It's a great American travel story. You know, we have these great
There's something
American
almost Huck
travel.
Finn about it,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just reread Huck Finn recently, which I had forgotten a lot of it had been like 20 years, you know, it had been a long time, and it's so good. But in any case, you know, I dropped out of high school after my sophomore year. I realized I could get a GED in 4 hours instead of 2 more years of high school. And so I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. And in my mind, all these choices I made were just completely natural and normal. And I realize now in retrospect, talking to other people, that in fact they were quite abnormal. Um, so I growing up in Cincinnati, I had a group of friends, and our idea of what being an anarchist was, we went bowling a lot, and we had a project where we sent free books to people in prison. And we used to do this weird thing where we'd hang out at a park and hit golf balls like in a normal park. I don't know who came up with this idea. Uh, and it was I don't know what the plan was. We would just like hang out and go golfing in a park. And do things like that. And of course, you know, the protesting against the war and so on. Um, and then when I was 17, I went down to New Orleans. This was right after the hurricanes, and I lived in a tent in New Orleans and was helping out there. And I was helping out people who were getting out of jail. And the jail in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina were cages in the back of the Greyhound station. And so what the police in New Orleans were doing is they would arrest as many people as they could. They'd put them in front of a judge and they'd say, okay, if you plead not guilty, we don't have room for you here. So we'll have to send you to Angola, the infamous prison. But if you plead guilty, we'll just give you community service. And community service, incidentally, was cleaning up the flooded jail.
Wow.
And so the police are just, you know, just arresting people and using it as free labor to clean up the jail. And then they were holding people in these like cages behind the Greyhound station. It was completely crazy. New Orleans is always crazy. Joe, you live in New Orleans now. So it got
It's still
crazier.
crazy. I'll
It
let
got
you know.
crazier after the
Yeah.
hurricanes, but it was like that. Like a lot of the cops drove Cadillacs that they looted and stuff. It was a wild place. But I was living in a tent for a month, you know, in New Orleans, which was interesting. And then came back home, and then I moved to Kentucky, and I rented an apartment for $60, or in a room in an apartment for $60 a month. It was a very gross apartment, you know, and I worked at like FedEx, Kinko's, you know, making $8 an hour. But when your rent is only $60 a month, $8 an hour goes really far, actually. And we would wait and get scanned in by students at the university cafeteria, which was all you can eat once you were inside. And then we rented like a little warehouse that we turned into a music venue and would do shows there and stuff until eventually the city shut us down. But what I appreciated about the CrimethInc thing is that it gave me permission to just do things, just to try things. Like I always made zines. A lot of them, I'm sure, are just horribly stupid now. I started making zines when I was like 13, 14. And I would just try to work out my ideas in this kind of quasi-public way. And I would always send them off to Maximum Rock and Roll and Heart Attack and get reviewed, which was funny because when you got reviewed, then you got a free copy of the episode that your thing got reviewed in. But it was this permission to act and just to try things, like, you know, oh, I can just hitchhike to Athens, Ohio. Like,
Yeah.
why not? And you can just talk to people, like walk around and talk to strangers and ask
Yeah.
them things and hang out. You can Oh, you don't have a place this, like on the way down to New Orleans, we like spent the night at a gazebo in Decatur, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we
You
just
know,
could.
It makes the world so much bigger, right? That was the most beautiful thing about it, is that like that sense of possibility, that sense of kind of giving permission to like try stuff out and do weird stuff and talk to whoever you wanted. I mean, I met you in that disgusting apartment in Lexington. That's where we first met each other and became friends. And
I thought we first
incidentally,
met in West Virginia.
oh yeah, that's right. We met in West Virginia, but then we actually like really spent time together in Lexington. Um, and your apartment might have been gross, but I was way grosser.
Yes, you were.
Like just myself personally.
You were disgusting.
And I wanted to point out, I guess briefly, just like something you said. You were like, you talked about all the stuff that you did, hitting golf balls in the park, writing zines, so on and so forth. And then you said something like, and we protested the war. And especially in hindsight, it's so interesting to think about how the politics, quote unquote, the organizing or whatever, was so secondary, I think, for like us. That wasn't the case for other people that I knew, for whom like political organization was actually like the most important thing. But for me, it was always like secondary to this sense of like broadening my sense of the world, trying to like figure out the limits of my agency and expand them, get better at doing stuff, meet interesting people. Like that's what it was all about for me. And all of the kind of like protesting this and that, like it was, if you asked me at the time, I would say that was really important. But obviously, like reflected in what I was actually doing, I cared a lot less about that than I did about like, I don't know, hanging out with you and like meeting other weirdos and like trying to write stuff and stuff like that.
I think I was a lot more political than you were, Joey. Like the political ideas were very important to me, and getting those right and thinking through them. And I was an animal rights activist, and doing things with people in prison, helping people in prison was very important to me. Like we met in West Virginia at a protest camp about mountaintop removal, where I had been invited to come speak about some prison issue.
Yeah.
Which is also wild in retrospect. I was like, I don't know how old I was. I would be a teenager and I would get like invited to speak places about something, which in my mind was just totally normal. But in retrospect, like who the hell was I? What did I know, about anything that I would get invited to speak places? So
I think it's funny for me because, excuse me. I think there's there's a way in which the CrimethInc spirit, or the stuff you guys are talking about right now, like it's odd. I think it resonates with a certain kind of, I hate to say it, but like normal American right now, in the sense that like there's been a closing off. This was how I squared the "is this political or not" kind of question. Because like if you look at the forces that we've lived through basically since the crash, I guess, or since Iraq, or since 9/11, I guess, where the surveillance state has grown much more powerful. The kind of financial forces constricting our lives have become much more powerful. And like, even today, or this week, there was a Wall Street Journal story, New York Times story, about how farmland is, like on average, like tripled in price or something in the US in recent years. Like that's a constriction of human freedom. That's a constriction of your option to go with your friends and like try something out and try like a new system of living, a new way of trying to interact with the world. That stuff of like, oh, my rural town, like I can't rent a place for $60, much less $600. You can't do that anymore. That is constriction of your freedom to experiment and try to live. And maybe this is too rosy, but my political project at that time was trying to tell people, hey, when this hits you, you're not going to have that freedom that you experience now. Like this is going to come for you too. And like, we're trying to figure it out. And this is politics. This is politics on a global scale. Like these forces are coming for you. They are going to take. This is why I also think like I never had a problem with squaring my internal like love of America with anarchism, because I considered the American project one of like devolving power downward and experimenting with new ways of finding human freedom. And I always felt like CrimethInc like was consonant with that project, even though everybody around CrimethInc was like, we hate America, America sucks. Like the basic American spirit, I thought was really consonant with the project of CrimethInc and the project of America work together. And I think it's funny now, like going back to like, why is the left not into globalization and stuff, is like, there's a certain kind of like technocratic liberal that is really scared of that fringy experimentation, that fringy sort of unmonitored human freedom, human expectation that you are going to solve your own problems for yourself. And like, especially in this sort of little corner of the internet that we're in, people are really into that. People like that. And it's running up against the kind of mainstream environmental movement. It's running up against like the mainstream of like what the left or left liberalism looks like right now. And like, that's why I still love the anarchist stuff. That's why I still feel like it was and still is formative for me, because I think all of these conversations that now dominate our swirling hellscape of Twitter and kind of questions of like, is global politics reorienting around whether or not we're going to have a big global society and stuff. It's weird in the ways in which like, actually like, am I going to be a train hopper and hang out with my buddies on a farm? Like that actually is the same conversation to me. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about this. Cause like, I don't really feel like the stuff I write about and think about is really that different than when I was 15. And
so James, it's interesting the story you paint of, from 2001 to now as one of tightening control. And I think the cost of living thing, I absolutely agree with you about. There's so much freedom in having a low cost of living. So much freedom. Like everything I was able to do in my late teens, early 20s was because it was so cheap to live in Lexington, Kentucky, that you could travel for a few months and just kind of pick up jobs here and there, and it was fine. Because the rent was so cheap, you didn't need to have any to really make money, and you could like open a music venue as an 18-year-old. I'm still wild that guy leased a building to me. But I think that there's some countercurrents, actually. Like, to give a couple examples, one is that homeschooling is now way more common and easier and more normal now, certainly than in 2001, and then even more so it wasn't even really legal going back earlier. It was sort of quasi-legal. And now it's totally normal, which is interesting. But that's a current where people are going away from sort of constrictive, like state-sponsored things. So that's a current. And then it's also been fascinating that I don't think it's just a mirage, that there's a real turn among some people across a fascinating from a fascinating variety of backgrounds politically and whatever, towards doing real things, whether it's like really going at it for homesteading or just getting into gardening. Or I was at a workshop last night about like sharpening knives and tools, like by hand. And it was just a little small group of us, and it was great, but that something's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Way more so, with involving way more people than 20 years ago, I think. That there's been a new wave of that, but that it's not tied into those same networks. And it's not even particularly countercultural, or it's not tied to any of the sort of standard. It's not a hippie thing. It's not a punk thing. Like when I talk to other parents here who are doing homeschooling, I'm always struck by how normal they are, how they don't have particularly ideological reasons for doing it. That the reasons are just like, oh, I don't want my kid gone at some school full time, like family life is important to us and things like that. There's no like, oh, the government panopticon or something. That sort of language isn't in the conversation. So I think it's interesting that
That's,
these two things, that was not to contradict what you're saying necessarily, but that there are other things happening that are
I would
making
just
American life more free. But the cost of living thing is very oppressive. It's makes it very difficult to maneuver.
I want to toss in one thing really quick, which is like backyard vegetable gardening. Also, when I first was doing this, like when I finally settled down in a place after traveling for some years, it was in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was functionally illegal. Like the city would come around and like cite you and charge you money if you had like vegetables growing in your yard. And I think that that was the case in many kind of like American cities. That was, municipal ordinances against growing tomatoes and they would always say, oh, it's because of the rats or whatever. And now you can basically do it everywhere and everybody does it. So yeah, this is just like another place where I see exactly the thing that Don is saying, like on like it's a small thing, but it's a small thing done at a really big scale, which is really interesting. Like, homeschooling isn't like, walking back the NSA surveillance state or whatever. It's on a small scale, or it's like a little thing. It's close and proximate, but so many people are doing it that like the net effect is big, and that's very interesting.
And it can
I think
totally
that's true.
transform a place because public school funding is from headcount. Public school funding is from headcount. It's from the number of students enrolled. That's how they get their funding. So it can actually if a big chunks of students moving to homeschool can really transform a city. The backyard chickens thing is another thing, Joey, like beyond even just vegetables. That's totally
it's huge.
Absolutely normal. No one bats an eye.
There's some really rich people around the corner from where I live in New Orleans that have like sheep in their backyard. Like this would have been unthinkable, I think. Even 5 years ago, not even, think like 10 or 15 years ago.
And the people doing it aren't hippies or hipsters or punk,
My thing here is that it's, no pun intended, but it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? Where it's like, yes, I agree with all that stuff and I find it generally positive, I think. I mean, it's hard. Like LA lost 30%. LAUSD lost 30% of enrolled students in the course of the last 3 years, which is like, that's
astonishing.
Yeah, that's just going to be over. That's game over. They're literally, there was a piece on the A section of the LA Times a couple weeks ago that I actually got Good Old Boys to cover on their news show because I thought it was such a Good Old Boys story. But they're recruiting babies. They're going to hospitals and recruiting newborns to enroll in like a newborn education program because they're just so.
Dude, no way.
It's so funny. It's one of the funniest stories I've ever read, but also very dark, right?
Yeah.
And the result of that is that they're going to have to close neighborhood schools and they're going to do more consolidations, which will make school even worse. Then more people will leave.
Right.
Yeah.
And my argument here is not that you guys are wrong about this stuff. And like the sort of funny theme emerging in Joey and my our conversations over the years now. Years? Is it years? And
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So. It's more than a year. Is that I'm more of a doomer than Joey and a little more negative about some of this stuff and a little more convinced the system itself is kind of going to spin out of control. So my personal read on that stuff is like that somewhere on a deep soul level, even your normies now are looking around and going, I don't have enough contact with the real. And like, I just think it's empirically true that, I mean, maybe you guys disagree, but like, sure, you're going to a knife sharpening thing. But 25 years ago, more Americans were spending more time sharpening knives than they are now because fewer Americans were addicted to their phones and living in this weird sort of metaverse hellscape, like screen-based life that we have now.
Oh, sure. That's true. Yep.
And so like, even if people are responding to that, they're responding to a disconnection from the real and a constriction that now they're rebelling against, which I think is positive. I think the school thing is like, in the same way that I'm like a doomer, like I'm sort of a doomer cheerleader and also like very scared of what comes next. Like the school thing is crazy because it's like, what happens if LAUSD just disappears? Like what, you lose 30% of your kids, like that's not going to work. Like that system, the pyramid scheme of endless growth and stuff, like when that starts spinning off the rails, like, are you guys ready for that? I'm not. I don't even own a house. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have a garden. Like, I just travel around and report. And that, you're kind of like, oh, I might miss the bus. This may start spinning out before I'm ready. And I say that because I think it is really heartening to see people starting to realize we got to a point where I'm not going to take the sort of like fake life and the constriction anymore, and to respond to that, and to adopt to some degree like the same ethos that felt rebellious to us when it was like CrimethInc and it was like sharpen your own knife, like develop skills, like be more free. Like, it's really cool to see people doing that, but I do think it's a response to the constriction of those forces that it like driven people to a breaking point.
There's a divergence that's emerging, I think,
yes.
where you're seeing like there's like screen kids and there's non-screen kids.
Yes. And bugmen and non-bugmen amongst.
Well, I don't like that. I don't like that language, but
okay, I do. But okay, yeah.
But like the kids who are growing up glued to a screen 24/7, like you see them. That's how some parents parent now. They'll be outside, and the kid will be in the stroller looking at the thing, and that's inside, and it's just all day long. That's a non-insignificant subset of the population is growing up that way. Like deep social debilitation, social debilitation. It's hard to see how we recover from it. All right, you guys go ahead.
Well, wait, can I just really quickly? Can I ask, why do we not like bugmen? Is that a bad word? Did I just like? Can you guys, in a whip sense, educate me about why we?
I just think I just don't like it because it's like a big abstraction that's dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm. I, to some degree, like it because it is so combative, and I feel like it's good to be combative about that stuff. But I also feel like maybe it's a right-wing bodybuilder term, and I use it too loosely.
It might be. I don't have really thoughts. It's not a part of my lexicon, but I know what people mean when they say it. I mean, to go back to
guys, briefly, I think I have to go. You two carry on. I'm sorry, I have a sick 2-year-old I need to tend to.
Oh no, okay.
We'll pick this up again. You two take it home for me.
To get back to CrimethInc and to connect with this pessimism that Don had about kind of like kids growing up with screens and stuff. I mean, I grew up on the internet basically. When I was really young, I used AOL like 2.0 or something. Like I was like, one of the first sort of cohorts of young people to be on the internet and to spend a lot of time on it. And I mean, one of the things that CrimethInc did for my life, or that, sort of crust punk, anarcho DIY world, or whatever you want to call it for my life, was it got me off of the internet for like 6 whole years. And I would occasionally like log into my email or something when I was in a public library, and I did a lot of corresponding through email. I have a lot of those emails still, which is pretty incredible. I can go back and look at like all these passionate, lyrical emails I sent to total strangers and ex-lovers and whatever. But I was not online, and like my sense of the world was not given from the news. I didn't read the news ever. I would look at anarchist news occasionally, but even that I took with a grain of salt because I knew that it was propaganda. And I'm not sure that there has been anything that has been better for my sense of reality than to spend six or so, maybe even more than that, because after I stopped like riding trains, I went and lived on a farm in southern Kentucky for like 1.5 years, 2 years or so. And then when I moved to Lexington after that, I wasn't reading the news. Like I just wasn't, like my sense of the world was not mediated through the news, through the internet, through whatever. It was about kind of like what I saw in the first person, like on the day-to-day level. And I mean, the good news is that kind of thing is still possible, even, and I get the sense that like, that Zoomers, for instance, who are the first generation to grow up entirely with the internet, like for me, I can remember life before the internet a little bit. And then when we first had the internet, it was dial-up internet. So there was a lot of time not online. You had to go and sit at a computer to do it. But the Zoomers are like the first tablet generation. and they seem to be really exhausted with it.
Yeah.
Even if they use it a lot, if you ask them, like apparently like this is a common poll response, is that they'll say that they think that screens and the internet and stuff like that has had too much influence on their lives and so on and so forth. So I'm interested to see, whether there's another sort of wave of an unplugging that happens. And it might even happen through the internet. I mean, the first CrimethInc convergence that I went to in Bloomington, Indiana, I learned about from CrimethInc.net, the website. And a lot of my sort of early interaction with this stuff happened by making connections online, and then I sort of decoupled. Right, that was the sort of route that I got the inspiration to sort of leave it. But I don't know. I mean, I also just I think like, I mean, I was going to say like, I was going to push back, I think, on your sense of like, the knife sharpening thing in particular, right? The sense that I have, and I'm willing to be disabused of this, I think, is that actually like we are in an era of a lot, like just as Don was saying, right? Like we're in an era of like less like total systemic control of everything than what was happening in like the late 90s. And that actually that era, there were far fewer people that were doing things for themselves. There was far more kind of like connection into systems and ceding your own agency to these big abstractions and so on and so forth. And like to a certain extent, right, in as much as the internet is participatory in a certain type of way, it's an improvement over the television. And like I've fixed a lot of things by looking at YouTube, and like I'm not the only one. I think a lot of people have a kind of relationship, a renewed relationship with the world that comes from using the internet in a certain type of way that, again, I think is like it's an improvement over the previous sort of televised dispensation. But again, I'm willing to be disabused of this. That might just be my optimism showing through.
That is true. I mean, I'm pretty good at fixing cars now, and that's a 100% via YouTube. I'm pretty good at training.
Yeah.
Now. That's 100% via YouTube. That stuff is true. And it's funny. I was talking to a certain well-known nefarious billionaire this weekend, and he made a kind of similar point to what you're making, which is like, if you think about it in like a really macro scale, like a really macro, like just how did globalization work, and was the project going to work, and how does this all play out? Like the high water mark of it was actually 2007, when like global trade as a percentage of GDP was the high water mark of that was 2007. And so like the kind of millenarian end of days, we're going to make a system that works for everybody and it's going to span across the globe as this kind of like networked consumerist system. Like it was already kind of, the wheels were coming off even then. And I think you and Don, your optimism is not really that different than my pessimism, in the sense that like I think what we're looking at is like I think I'm right. I mean, maybe you disagree. I think I'm right that like there are increasing layers of like control and hyper complexity that are washing over us to this day in really, really severe and kind of like scary ways. But that at the margins of those systems, because they're not working as well as they did in 2001, like there's a lot of freedom and potential at the edges of those places, because everybody kind of gets like, let's talk about this. And I know this is going to maybe make some of our more religious or conservative listeners or whatever uncomfortable, but like shoplifting today is radically easier than it was in 2004. It's crazy. Like, and that to me is like a really weird key indicator of something that I think is both maybe positive and negative, in the sense that like now I think it's pretty common I know for a fact it's pretty common amongst my peer group for just people to go to a what do you call it? The little self checkout things, and just steal a third of their grocery bag, which would have never happened in 2005. They would have been too scared to steal a third of their groceries. But like, there's a weird combo of like disbelief in the system and understanding that actually the systems of control can't get them anymore. And that I think has liberated people, but also like created a kind of weird nihilism. There's a weird dance where the attempts to kind of create this kind of like technological network matrix hellscape thing are growing more intense, but they're also just like less functional, and they work like people see the fraying of that system in ways that kind of gives a lot of liberatory potential. And I know shoplifting is a weird example, but I mean, not to blow up anybody's spot, but I feel like we've all shoplifted a lot in our day. And so it's something I sort of think about now when I see people doing it. And even trains, like, you know, Joey, maybe this is actually interesting to talk about, but both you and I noticed something with regard to the train robberies that were happening in Southern California.
Yeah.
And I think it shocked both of us because back in the day, it never occurred to me to crack a container. I would have never, like, while I'm riding a freight train, I'm living off the fat of that system. But I almost like believe enough in the project of like the train companies that it would feel like immoral and weird to like crack one of their containers. Like they're doing me a favor. And now
it's one of the
like,
great laws of the train riding.
yeah.
You don't touch the cargo.
And now that seems to have broken down. And that it's a weird kind of like, oh, you can't get me. I'm not going to get in trouble anyway. I'll do whatever I want. It's that. And it's also like, who cares? None of this means anything. It doesn't matter. There's no honor amongst thieves, and we're all thieves now in this system anyway. And some of that I find hopeful, and some of it I find really depressing because, like, I don't know, again, I kind of like America, and it'd be nice if people believed in it, but I think that's going away. And I think that's part of what this liberatory stuff that we're seeing is people just don't care anymore.
I mean, my sense of is like less that there's a sort of net increase or net decrease or whatever in like amounts of freedom or something, and but rather that just like that the control is located in different places. Like it seems totally obvious, for instance, that like the internet is a place of like extra of like there's an especially high amount of like regulation and control happening online, which used to not be the case. It used to be this place of like, you know, you could do all kinds of stuff on there, including lots of horrible stuff, which I guess you can still kind of do if you have the right technologies or whatever. But I mean, there's a reason why there's so much emphasis from kind of normies pointed at the internet about regulation and, oh, Elon Musk needs to do this and Facebook needs to do that and blah, blah. Because that's just kind of, it's like this particularly heightened amount of control in this particular domain. And at the same time, right, like one of the other things that really weirds me out about our age is you hear all of these stories, and this happened to some friends, a number of friends of mine in Kentucky, of like kids walking around their neighborhood alone, having the cops called on them and their parents getting in trouble. Yeah. This is one of these really weird things about our time that like the sort of freedom of children to just kind of wander around and be kids in the neighborhood is like less and less the case. And an even smaller world of this that I've been thinking about lately is I don't see outside cats anymore. You know, like people have these really like hyper intense ideas about like how you're supposed to keep your pets and how you're supposed to keep your kids and like in the online spaces. But then, yeah, just sort of just as you noted, James, like right alongside that, there's a whole bunch, like it's weirdly easier to do a whole bunch of different types of crime. Although I don't know, I've thought about train riding. Like one of the reasons why I got out of it, I mean, I spent like 4 years doing it pretty regularly. And I got arrested in Central Ohio in the lovely town of Mansfield. Spent a weekend in the Richland County jail there, because it seemed like train companies were starting to get really like protective, hyper protective, and they were starting to jack up their the types of things they would charge you with if you got caught. And this, I think, to some extent was a consequence of like illegal immigration hysteria. You know, that like people, you know, even in places like Ohio, people would talk about like illegal immigrants traveling on trains and so on and so forth. And so that seemed to be a part of kind of this like more national kind of sense of fear or about this particular issue, or that something needs to happen. But yeah, so like the trains got harder to ride. You know, like children can't go walk down the street to the park without their parents having the cops called on them. The internet is like full of like weird government spying programs, and all of our cell phone data is being piped through the NSA and blah 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 blah. But yeah, at the same time, there's just like a whole bunch of other weird criminal stuff that has been kind of easier than ever. I mean, this doesn't make me particularly when I sort of express it in this way. I'm not. This isn't optimistic, but it does, like, I think, make the map clearer. You know?
Can I ask you?
So
Joe,
crime is really bad, and one of the reasons it's really bad now is that all crime is tied into the drug trade and organized crime. That when you see videos of the mass train looting or all these shoplifting videos, I'm sure you've seen, where people just go in and are like clearing out whole shelves, all of that is organized crime. The people, it's going through networks where they sell the stuff.
That's true.
Online or sell it, whatever. And so and then it's all incidentally or directly tied to the drug trade as well. And one thing, maybe you talked about this while I was gone, that's changed is like meth, and the type of meth has changed.
Yeah.
The environment where you can't really hang out with homeless guys as much anymore.
I think about that all the time. Yeah. Because
there's a level of danger there that didn't exist previously, and a level of like psychosis and potential violence and all of those interactions that didn't exist previously. So in terms of that freedom to be outside the norm, like that has really changed things significantly. There's a level of violence and there that just didn't exist previously.
That's very true. And a level of like, you know, one of the ways that I got into train hopping actually was I was downtown Cincinnati, and there was a guy playing guitar on the street, and he had somebody find this, please, but he had a tape of his music. His name was Raccoon, and the tape was called Rainbow Warrior, and the track 10, I'll never forget, was called I'm the Dumpster Diver. And it was like a weird map for like free living. Like he was just a traveler guy. He was old too. He wasn't like our generation of traveler kids. He wasn't a punk rocker. He was just a friggin' homeless traveler guy with a guitar. And he gave me a tape. It was like a spiritual experience. And now it's not that guy can't exist. Maybe he can't, but like, you know, I still hang out with homeless guys all the time, and it's like friggin' like, where are we gonna find drugs? Like, I got shot in the face. I picked up a hitchhiker in New Mexico recently. His name was Breeze. He's out there if you're in New Mexico. He's always on 25. And he had literally just got shot in the face with a 22, and he had a prescription for Valium, and he was just, and it was like, this is fine, but it's like not, it's sort of not what I remember. And I'm curious, like, I was gonna say too that my girlfriend did a New Yorker story about those train robberies, and you're exactly right. Like it's Armenian gangs who are kicking down, like they're rounding up homeless meth heads and selling them drugs in exchange for what they're robbing from the trains, and it's like a weird organized crime thing. And the cops basically talk to the Armenian gangsters and like have them corral people and keep order and stuff. It's really, really like. The point that I'm trying to make is everything is becoming more and more Blade Runner-ish. It's like everything is getting sharper, and like the edges are getting harder. It's getting a little scarier out there.
And this was where the CrimethInc thing broke down a little bit, I think. Is that the story is always that the government is the bad guy, and the outlaws, if not good guys, are at least kind of cool. Yeah. And I don't think that actually works anymore. And also that there's not a clear dividing line between the two, especially in some places. Like, I mean, in Los Angeles, a lot of the police recruitment is done as gang recruitment. Like that they function, that there are actually gangs within the LAPD that have tags like
LAUS,
and stuff.
or sorry, LASD. It's in the sheriff's department, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry. You know this way better than I do. And in New Orleans, the same way. It was like the police functioned as a criminal gang, just sort of the most powerful one. And I think there was a lot of naivete about that, about how the actual functioning, how these things actually functioned and get talked about. It got sort of abstracted a lot. And that there isn't a kind of monolithic state. It doesn't exist. There's lots of different competing organizations and forces that sometimes are able to be organized and funneled in certain directions. But I don't know. It's interesting, like things like NGOs, organized crime, etc., weren't part of our analysis at all. And they actually have a huge part. The Guy Debord's Comments on Society, the Spectacle, very prescient book, lays all of this out. I mean, it's interesting. He sort of, I think, painted a picture really clearly about all these things. But I think, so both of you get to go soon. So I don't know how to wrap it up.
Let's talk about Ohio. Or the Ohio.
Yeah. Ohio Valley, just for a second, at least. I mean, it seems interesting and important to me that that a lot of our sensibilities were shaped in the Ohio Valley, right? You guys are from Cincinnati. I'm not from that part of the country. I mean, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up in Central Florida, but I sort of came of age in Huntington, West Virginia, which is like a much smaller city than Cincinnati, but is still one of these Ohio River cities. And James and I were talking online at some point. I think Don, you were a part of this also. I'm just talking about the strangeness of river cities generally, and about the Ohio Valley as its own kind of like sub-region of America with its own kind of set of things going on, and it's sort of its own kind of like specific kind of cultural characters and you know, kinds of people who are around there. So I don't know. It seemed worth just taking a second to kind of talk about how we feel the Ohio Valley has contributed to sort of our sense of things. You know, this kind of Bugbeean connection between place and thought, and just how we feel about the Ohio Valley generally.
I mean,
what do you think, James?
Yeah, I'll start in the sense that, so I and I think I'm to some degree right about this. Like, I experienced Cincinnati as like a place that growing up felt like it was sort of the American place. Like, it wasn't Southern, it wasn't Northern, it wasn't like East Coast. It wasn't even Rust Belt. It was like, it was sort of placeless. It was place as placelessness in a certain way. And I found that, like, I mean, I've talked about this before on this podcast, but the Ohio Valley is a kind of interesting coming together of a lot of the early American tribes. Sort of, you had Virginians, you had people coming from the sort of Northeast, you had a wave of Germans, and then you sort of mingled in this place that, I don't know, Don, do you agree with this? You mingled in this place that became, in a sense, like not a regional place, but one of the early places that were just American. And I found that very formative. And I also found it like, this sort of like hits to like why I am so sort of like anti-globalist, is like, I felt like it was really easy to have Cincinnati's unique culture, and there is unique culture. I felt like it was easy to see that disappearing, and maybe easier to see it disappearing in Cincinnati than it would have been in other places. And I felt the loss of that really extremely. So like when I went off to Quebec and I saw like waves of just like hipster Anglophones like colonizing Montreal, like it like hit me in a gut level, and it like really freaked me out. And I was like, oh wow, I really don't like globalization. Like, this is bad. I would like different places to stay different.
I agree with you about Cincinnati as a American place, but I didn't experience that as placelessness necessarily.
Yeah.
And it's also confirmed in that, like, the television voice tends to be a Southern Ohio accent.
Yep.
Like, sportscasters are all from Ohio.
Yep.
And outside of the SEC network.
Yeah.
So that is another sort of confirmation of that. I mean, my experience of Cincinnati is that the here, one second.
Well, Joey, let me ask you while he's talking. Okay.
Sorry, I just
you got it. Okay.
Finish my thought. Is every time I go back to Cincinnati, I'm delighted actually by how the rate of change is so much slower than other places. And I can still go to North Side, and it feels like the North Side I hung out in as a teenager. Directly around UC has definitely been built up. I don't know if you remember this, but there used to just be like empty lots.
Yep.
Of like concrete and gravel right next to the university. And there was like a Taco Bell.
Yeah.
And then Krishna's Indian Carryout, you know, on Calhoun, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
It was just empty lots for like forever. And now it's these big, ugly apartment, like student housing things. But Krishna's Indian Carryout, the greatest restaurant on earth, is still there. The same guys still work there. The menus are still the same, and they still serve you food on styrofoam.
Yep.
Perfect. Northside, though, honestly, it feels like I was there fairly recently. The same used appliance stores, like everything about it felt identical. Hamilton, Ohio, where my family's from, also feels, you know, kind of locked in time a little bit, at least from, it's obviously changed a lot from when my dad was a kid, but from when I experienced it growing up. Yeah, I love it. Whenever I'm back in Ohio, it just feels good. Like all the people look familiar, sound familiar, and it just feels good. And it feels like it hasn't been hollowed out in a way that lots of other places have.
Yeah. Can I bounce?
I don't know how that happened, but that's how and now I don't know. I didn't hang out in Over the Rhine, and I'm sure like Over the Rhine is way different now than it was when I was a teenager.
Yeah. Joey, I'm going to bounce to you off of something that I was just thinking about, which is that Cincinnati is interesting in the sense that there's a middle class accent and then a very distinct like lower middle class accent that is like a little bit countrified. And like that, I'm guessing the accent, that is an accent that's representative of the culture that you were in Huntington and stuff like that, and in Louisville and places like that. And I'm curious, like, how did you find the interplay between people who talk like me, who are from the Ohio Valley, and guys who say crick and stuff like that? Like, did you experience that divide?
Yeah, well, I think kind of, sort of. I mean, my first experience with the Ohio Valley was in Huntington when I was in high school, and I'm not from there, you know. I moved up there from Florida, and I had already undergone the process that they put all like smart Southern kids through in gifted education, which is like training you out of your Southern accent. Mm-hmm. So I show up with this, you know, sort of talking like any of the other sort of smart kids in the high school. And I mean, I guess the interesting thing about Huntington, from my perspective, was that, you know, I really feared moving there when I was a kid. I thought I was going to be moving from somewhere that was kind of like, you know, relevant and interesting, namely Florida, even if I lived in like a swamp, to the absolute backwater of the universe, namely West Virginia. But then when I landed in Huntington, I mean, it was immediately clear to me that I had moved somewhere significantly more cosmopolitan than I had been before. And that, you know, it is like it's a river city. I mean, Florida is pretty cosmopolitan in a certain sense, right? There's lots of different kinds of people who are there. Like, you know, I was of a sort of white minority in my middle school. There were lots of Cubans and Dominicans and people from New York City and people from, you know, the Midwest and people from, you know, all kinds of other places that had all moved to Florida for some reason. But Huntington was like, it had a kind of, you know, there's like an orchestra there and museums and, you know, people from different countries and stuff like it was just this kind of different kind of cosmopolitan experience that I hadn't encountered before. Mm. And, you know, and I think as regards kind of like the accent thing, like there's certainly kind of like the sort of, West Virginian Appalachian kind of hillbilly thing that exists kind of in and around, more around Huntington. I mean, Huntington is like a strangely, it's like a big city in West Virginia, and so a lot of the people who live there are kind of like big city West Virginians. But it was a very working class city for a long time. So they had, the CSX railroad that runs through there was a big employer for much of the 20th century. It's not so much anymore. There was a big nickel plant that my stepdad's dad worked at for many, many years that shut down when I was in high school. And there were a lot of people employed there. And so, there's kind of like it's less like the kind of hillbilly Appalachian accent than it is just kind of like a, working class West Virginian kind of roughness that was then kind of separated from, like the especially kind of like the theater girls, who like spoke very well and so on and so forth. But I found that, the divide was actually sharpened in Louisville. That was a place where I noticed more of a kind of class gap reified in the way that people spoke. Because I think that there's just a lot more like rural Kentuckians. There are a lot more like Black people in Louisville, and West Louisville is like its own kind of big, huge part of the city that's predominantly Black, and like they've got their own thing going on. And there was kind of more to it, and it was more of a patchwork and tapestry than Huntington. There's also far richer people in Louisville than there are in Huntington. I mean, you have kind of local elites in Huntington, and the university has like, some professors who talk like professors and so on and so forth. But Louisville is really like, it's funny, especially thinking about it now. I mean, a lot of people in my age cohort that I know, like they grew up in some city somewhere and they always dreamt about moving to New York or something. That was their place, their far off place that they really wanted to live in. And for me, I mean, I remember like listening to like records when that were from bands in Louisville when I was in like living in the middle of nowhere in Florida, and just being like, man, Louisville, Kentucky's got to be the coolest place on earth. And this is my New York City, Right. And I finally moved there, and in a certain sense, like for the places that I had grown up, it really is like a big, interesting, like neighborhood. It's sort of neighborhoody, diverse, fascinating city with all kinds of things going on. But there also is like, they're like, it's huge. I mean, Louisville, it has a metro consolidation. So there's like 1 million people technically in the city of Louisville. It stretches like really far out into the east, which has like a lot of really kind of like expensive suburbs, and then goes into like country parts. Down in the south, like in like Shively and getting out toward like Bullitt County, gets like really rednecky. It covers a huge span of land. And yeah, I think it was there. Yeah.
So, all right. And then we'll have you bring us home here on this question.
I'll try.
Yeah. But so I just drove through Grove City, Ohio, south of Columbus, which they call Grove Tucky. Because of the diaspora, the Appalachian diaspora that spread across the Ohio Valley, during the hard times in the coal fields. And I'm actually candidly not sure about Louisville, but Cincinnati, Columbus, Chicago all have this kind of hillbilly highway heritage of people who came from Appalachia, who were generally like quite tied to the land, and in some way or another, whether by extracting resources or farming or whatever, worked on and were influenced by the landscape. And so I have this friend Hal who's from kind of Alabama and writes about nature a lot, and he likes to identify places where the culture and the lifestyle are influenced by the geography and the landscape and the ecology. And those are places he's interested in. Other places he's not, and so he won't go to LA, for example. And I would quibble with him on that front. I think LA is deeply tied to its geography and ecology. But the point that I'm making is that when I go to Cincinnati, I actually do sort of feel that lack. Like I don't personally feel that the eastern woodlands and the river city aspect of Cincinnati is a major formative influence on the culture and the way of life there. And it sounds like you maybe have a different experience of the Ohio Valley, and B, a different view of that stuff. So, like, do you think there is an Ohio Valley sort of ecological ethos and shaping force? Or do you think that it's sort of papered out and suburbanized and sort of lost to the texture of culture in your experience there?
There's certainly a lot of the kind of suburbanization and stuff, right? Like, Cincinnati has huge sprawling suburbs going both across the river in northern Kentucky, and then also like, heading north out of the city, right? Louisville's got, big suburbs, and southern Indiana is heavily very suburban. I guess my sense of like what makes the Ohio Valley, or what makes kind of river cities connected to each other in a way that kind of constitutes a region in my head has less to do with like the ecology per se, except as we understand that ecology as being the river, right? Like, right. Because the people who like moved from, the hills of Kentucky to a place like Louisville, or to, Newport, or to Huntington, West Virginia, or whatever, like, they're just one group that flocked to these cities, right? I mean, the other one of the major immigration waves that shaped Louisville was like the Germans after 1848. I mean, this is a case in Cincinnati too, right? All those Germans that moved to these river cities, like, they built over the Rhine, they built, huge parts of these cities, and like heavily influenced the culture and the landscape and the building stock and all of these places. And in the case of Louisville, I mean, I don't think this was the same thing in Cincinnati. It seemed like the Germans that were there stuck around for longer, but the Germans and the Irish in Louisville, I think it was sometime in like the 1860s, maybe a little earlier, there was a nativist riot they call Bloody Monday, where a bunch of these like know-nothing nativists rampaged the streets and attacked German and Irish homes and businesses and churches, and like set a bunch of them on fire and killed a lot of people. And then a bunch of Louisville's German population moved to St. Louis and Cincinnati and just never came back.
So we had just, this is, I always love this one. Cincinnati's history is largely told in the history of riots, and ours,
yeah.
There's very little like written history of Cincinnati. If you go to the library, there's not much. But one of the chapters and you can find in German books is Der Kampf mit dem Know-Nothings.
Amazing.
It's that. So very much the same thing. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. But I was just saying, I mean, that is what's key, I think, to me about these regions, is like that Louisville and Cincinnati and Huntington, West Virginia, and to some extent Pittsburgh are more similar to each other and are more similar to other river cities, like even like Memphis or New Orleans or something like that. They have more in common with them than Louisville does with Lexington, or than Cincinnati does with Columbus, or that Pittsburgh does with Harrisburg or something like that, that these river cities are and maybe this is, I'm gonna wager a thought and see what you think of it, but it might be that the lack of that connection between the kind of ecological and the form of life that happens in a place like one of these river cities is what makes them kind of the thing that they are. That they've been home to so many different kinds of people who've drifted in and drifted out. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing I'll say is that, it's these river cities that have been the only places that I've lived in my life that really felt like I could, like, even though I wasn't from there, that I could be from there. Like, I feel in many ways like a Kentuckian, but not because I lived in Lexington, or not because I lived in South Central Kentucky, but because I lived in Louisville. Because in these river cities, you can move there being from somewhere else and end up belonging. That's not so much the case for the kind of like cities in the interior, that are far more parochial and less open to outsiders, and kind of culturally closed in a way, which that's not a knock on them. That's just kind of how they are, Whereas in the river city, it's like you can move there from wherever and spend enough time and kind of like, live your life in the place. And in most of these places, you can just as easily say you're from there. It's an interesting and distinct sort of attitude to outsiders and insiders than exists in much of the place that surrounds them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. New Orleans being, of course, the great exception. But like, yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, too, my ancestors, as did many people, they didn't come through the Northeast corridor. They didn't come through Ellis Island. They landed at New Orleans and came up.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's actually very typical settlement pattern for like sort of mid 19th century immigrants to Cincinnati. I will just say that it would be nice, because I'm thinking about moving back and buying a farm. And I think a lot about, they talk about Chicago as like nature's metropolis, right? And you're like, Chicago? But it's a place where there is a real kind of thought and conception of Chicago and its situation on a landscape and the way that it functions as a corridor for resources to be transmitted from the Midwest to the East and to be capitalized and stuff. And it would be interesting to understand this region that we're talking about that most people don't know exists in the context of its nature and connection to resource corridors and stuff like that. And maybe one of us one day will write that. But everyone has to go. So
it's been chaotic, but very good.
I know it has been chaotic. I hope everyone liked this. I hope everyone stuck with us. I hope our recording actually works, which I think it will.
Yeah, me too.
And so I will close up by saying thank you, everyone, for coming to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I will say for Don, thanks for coming. This was his idea. So thanks to him for bringing us together. And Joey, hope to see you soon.
Yeah, likewise, man. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Take it easy.
All right, you too.